Well, hello there. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of Ecclesiastes. We are officially reaching the halfway point of the study, getting into Ecclesiastes chapter 6. A little bit of a shorter chapter than what we've had, but there's a lot to be said here, continuing the discussion of the purpose of life and also continuing the discussion of some of the harsh realities of life. And so Ecclesiastes 6 is going to start off with a little bit of a shocking image. And so we're going to dive right on into that. Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and verse 1. Again, we were joined by Trey Haskett from Tupelo, Mississippi, and Greg Kline from Birmingham, Alabama. Appreciate their continued input to this study, continued wisdom that they're offering. It's always a pleasure to study with good men of the word. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and verse 1, the writer says, "There is an evil which I have seen under the sun, and it is prevalent among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God has not empowered him to eat from them, for a foreigner enjoys them. This is vanity and a severe affliction. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they may be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say better the miscarriage than he, for it comes in futility and goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun, and it never knows anything. It is better off than he. Even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to the one place." And so the author just kind of comes right out of the gate with this chapter and really uses a pretty shocking image. The idea that of a man who has had success, has had wealth and honor, but he doesn't have satisfaction. If he has been faced some of the difficulties, a foreigner enjoys his work. He has fathered 100 children, yet does not even have a proper burial. He makes the comment, then better a miscarriage, better that he had never lived at all than this. And that's a pretty shocking statement to hear, because we as in our modern day, we so grieve over miscarriages. And I don't want to suggest that they didn't, 1,000 years ago, but miscarriages are such a tragedy, and it's seen as such a waste of potential. And yet I think kind of using the shock of that image, the preacher is almost kind of challenging our priorities and our value of life when he says, a life that is not honoring God, a life that is not living according to these to the basis that he's built up in this chance. It would have been better if you'd never lived at all. It would be better if you had just, faded straight from obscurity to obscurity. And so I don't think, like I said, he's making a lot of commentary on abortion politics or anything crazy like that. But I think he is trying to make us question our value of life. How do we value a life well lived? Do we value it based off of riches and wealth and honor? A lot of times we would see a guy like that, and we're thinking like, Bill Gates or a celebrity, and we're like, man, what a life they must live. I would love to have that life. And the author, I think, is really challenging our assertion of that. Is that really where we place priority in life? Is all of these earthly possessions and these earthly accomplishments? And he kind of concludes, he says, even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice, 2,000 years, a massive span of time, and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to one place. And again, it's this weight of death, this equalizing factor that it doesn't matter how wealthy you've been, how successful you've been, you could live to be Methuselah 2 times over, and yet you're still going to die. And so this is definitely a heavy chapter, but I think it's rightly challenging our perspective and our perception. Trey, what do you see in these couple of verses you want to bring out?
Things that we see here is certainly, as you mentioned, it's a heart check. It's a check on our perspectives, on our value system. And as we studied back in chapter 5, he kind of talked about a lot of these same things there back in chapter 5, verses 13 through 17, really. Just the grievous evil that somebody can have the good things of this life and not enjoy them. And here we go back into that again. But there's a key phrase here, and we see that at the end of verse 2, that he's been given all this wealth, all of these possessions, all of this honor, and yet God has not given him the power to enjoy them. And you may remember, going back to chapter 5, verses 18 through 20 there, he's talking with a different perspective, a different way to look at these things. And so kind of in the middle of this sort of depressing sandwich, there is this glimmer of light and hope of contentment and enjoying the things that God has given us. And I think that's really the key. What is it that unlocks our ability to enjoy the things that God has blessed us with? It's not necessarily the amount of what we've got. This guy, as you mentioned, could live, 100 lifetimes or 200 lifetimes, live 2,000 years, even if that's, the best of a lifetime. Living 2,000 years and having all of this stuff, having 100 sons or children. You think about, at least when I read this, I think about Job and all that he is blessed with, and just a picture like that of somebody who has all this abundance. But where is the satisfaction? Where is the enjoyment? Is it in the things of themselves, or is it in something else? And I think that's part of that check, part of that perspective that the Ecclesiastes, the preacher here is trying to get us to see is, where are we finding our enjoyment? Is it the things themselves? And if so, as he's pointed out several times over, we'll never be satisfied, or is it in something else? Greg, did you have something to add to all that?
Yeah, I think a couple things, and they're both found in verse 2, really stand out here. One of them is a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor. You need to always be careful that no matter what's happening, I realize that any good thing comes from God, that there is no amount of skill I could amount. There's no amount of wealth that I can grow. If I have good things, they are from God. That does three things for me. Number one, it helps me be willing to help others because I realize it's not mine. Number two, it does help me be thankful and think the positive of others and be thankful to God for what he has done. And number three, those previous two attitudes of giving and being thankful help insulate me from this problem of looking around and saying, well, somebody else is benefiting from my hard work. Well, okay, but where did it come from in the first place? It came from God. So who am I to say, well, this stinks that somebody else can have this? But also in verse 2, and on that second part, notice that God gives him such that he lacks nothing of all that he, do you see this word in verse 2 in the English Standard Version? Desires. This is the problem with desires. In a nutshell, the ecclesiastical problem is right here. He lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet he does not enjoy them. The eye will not be satisfied. The ear will not become full of hearing. There is no way to become content with the desires of this life. Can't happen. Won't happen. God, even in this particular instance, has given him all that he desires, all that he wants. But there's no satisfaction there. So much so that, as Andrew rightly said, that shocking image of the stillborn child is greater or of greater benefit in his rest. That's powerful. And that should be alarming to me to make sure, number one, am I giving credit to God where it belongs, always, and not just when I'm in a hole or when he takes me out of a hole? But number two, is it something powerful enough for me to say, you know what, I need to recheck what my priorities are. Am I striving for justice? Am I striving for love? Am I striving for pleasing God no matter what? Because any other aim, even if I get it all, it will not be enough. Powerful section here, powerful image. Let's read verse 7 through the end of the chapter here. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. Whatever has come to be has already been named, and it is known what man is, and that he is not able to dispute with one stronger than he. The more words, the more vanity, and what is the advantage to man? For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? For who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Andrew, why don't you kick us off here with understanding the second part of chapter 6?
Yeah, so I think you've got a couple of really profound points here. 7 through 9 really continues the discussion we were talking about in the first 6 verses, with this contrast between, again, the rich and the poor. And we saw him talk about this in chapter 5, where the preacher discusses the idea that, better to be a man who works hard and can sleep well than to be a man who is wealthy and spends all of his nights worrying about the state of his wealth. He kind of reemphasizes this point, is that at the end of the day, what advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have over the rich? And again, he's kind of, when you ask that question, what advantage does the poor man have? Your initial thought is like, well, nothing. The rich man has so much more stuff, and he's got more wealth and more time and more all these things. And again, the author is kind of challenging our perception, being like, but is that an advantage? Is an advantage to have more wealth and to have more things? Now, again, we don't want to put the cart before the horse. Being blessed by God is not a bad thing. Being blessed with prosperity, being blessed with those opportunities is not intrinsically a bad thing. And again, that goes back to that discussion in chapter 5 of being dealt a lot in life. Some people are dealt a lot that is comparatively better than someone else. But the question is, how do you use that lot? How do you appreciate that? And that's really kind of the whole point in verse 1 through 6, is that if you don't appreciate, if you don't find gratitude in your heart for things in life, it'd be better if you were never born at all. And so here he's kind of reemphasizing that point, that ultimately this pursuit of wealth, this pursuit of everything, he says what the eye see is better than what the soul desires. In other words, what you have right in front of you, what you have present, that's so much worth more than constantly seeking after a future wealth. And so then you really get in these last 3 verses, I think you're kind of having a transition point in the overall narrative. The first 6 chapters through the chapter 6, verse 9, really been emphasizing a lot about labor, really been emphasizing about kind of this relationship. Now we're going to start seeing a little bit more about the idea of the limitations of man's vision. That's been discussed a little bit to this point, but really going to be emphasized again in this next section, especially chapter 7 of the Proverbs that are going to come there, which is the issue that man has limited vision, that man is, he's a short-lived creature. He is ultimately the lesser compared to God. And so, he makes this point, who can dispute with him who is stronger than he? There are many words which increase futility. You can argue about what Kohelet is talking about. You could argue that reality should be different, that there should be a different way, but you're arguing with God, and all you're doing is just wasting words. And so I think there's a wisdom in accepting that the world is the way that it is. Now, God has promised us that there's a time to come where that will change. But the reality is that you have to accept the world on the terms that it is. Now, that doesn't change our objectives to improve things, to preach the gospel, to look for the betterment of our neighbors. But there is a wisdom in accepting the limitations of our abilities and the limitations of what we can do. Trey, what do you see here in these ideas? Maybe specifically about some of those limitations that we're talking about.
Yeah, there in verse 12, who can tell man what, as the section ends, who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? We don't know what's coming. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what's going to come after us in this life. And there's certainly a limitation there for us. And I think part of our struggle is that we want to know. We want to know what tomorrow is going to hold, what our next week is going to hold. We want to know what the world is going to be like for our children and what our legacies are going to be. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to know all of that. We're not going to have that sort of vision. And so again, I think as the preacher here wrestles with all of these ideas, he's trying to shape our perspective and trying to get us to think maybe in a way that we don't typically think of. Let go of some of that control. Let go of that wanting to know and plan and have some idea of what's coming. I do think as we look at the first part of verse 12, again, we're seeing some of this contrast. So I'll just read it again. It says, "For who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life?" And here is, I think, Andrew, you mentioned there's a transition here. Here's a transition a little bit, because he's been looking at life in all these different spheres, all these different arenas, and there's been a lot of things that he said, this is vanity, this is havel, this is striving after the wind. But now he begins, and he'll continue to talk about life itself as being vanity, as being this shadowy sort of thing. And if we can answer that question, maybe in the way that he is ultimately trying to get us to be thinking about, and where the, jumping a little bit ahead here, but where ultimately the narrator or the author of the book is going to lead us. Well, God knows what is good for man to be doing. And in fact, the preacher has already given us hints here and there about what we ought to be doing in this world in which we're not sure if we can hold on to what we've got. We're not sure what's coming after us. We don't even know if the things that we are given are going to delight us. because we're not sure how we're going to respond to those things. What the writer, or what the preacher rather, has said time and time again is continue to trust in God, continue to delight in him, continue to enjoy and be contented with the things that he has given us. And so I think that's what takes the uncertainty out of life. Certainly doesn't answer all of the problems, doesn't answer all of the questions we might have, but it does give us a sense of purpose and a sense of direction that's not just this smoke or vapor existence. And so that takes us back to some of those carpe diem passages, like in chapter 2 and in chapter 3, chapter 5 there that we've looked at, to delight in the things that God has given us. Greg, you have any final thoughts or applications here?
Yeah, I think as you look at this section, one thing that stands out is the dichotomy of verse 7 and 12. In verse 7, all the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. Now, we work for things and we're constantly going to need and want more. On the other hand, in verse 12, who knows what is good for man while he lives the few days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow? Rhetorical question. The answer is no man, only God. Second question, who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Again, no man, only God. And so as you look at this, unless otherwise revealed by God, we're kind of hopeless. We are stuck, because in verse 7, if I live just to kind of have the best life here and now, there's really no point to that, because I'm constantly going to be hungry until I die, in which case that really didn't serve any purpose. And in verse 12, I don't really know what happens after I die. So again, I'm not in control. Again, where's the purpose? But there is something there in the middle, and it's God. God knows. God is guiding us. God wants us to focus on what matters. And so not only for this section, but really even all of chapter 6, even going back to verses 1 and 2, as he surveys the evil of mankind, the temporary nature of things, the fact that someone else might benefit from my labors, the fact that I can keep hungering again after feeding myself, that is a man perspective that looks at this world. And we will never find true satisfaction here. It's interesting, when the devil tempted Jesus 3 times, he was constantly tempting him with earthly things. And we tend to look at Jesus like a superhero and say, well, of course that had no impact on him. But there's so many elements, and certainly what the Hebrew writer would say makes it clear Jesus was tempted. He was tempted. He was likely, or it was possible at least, for him to fail as a man, and yet he didn't. How did he stand up to the devil's temptations in chapter 4 of Matthew, for example? Well, by knowing the word, yes, by being completely submissive to God's word, and understanding that no matter what happened, he needed to please God. He wasn't living for ease. He wasn't living to please anybody else or to be in control of this life. He always just wanted to submit to God's will and be at his right hand. The question is, will I submit to God's will even when life's not going the way I want? And will I make God's goals my goals? Because there is satisfaction there. There is peace. There is the ability to be content only in God and his plan. Nothing else will work. No one else has the answers. And so I say, well, where are the answers to the questions of life? Well, as revealed by God. We would say that no man has these answers unless they're inspired by God, and that's an important distinction. When I look at the Bible pages, I need to know that the answers to my questions are there. Might not pop right out, might not be the exact 21st century question. I don't think you can turn to a Bible passage and say, well, how do I get Amazon Prime? But we can realize some important lessons about not being greedy, not wanting things that are not due to us, or maybe even being satisfied with what we already have. Those applications are here, and God has the plan for us if we'll simply trust and obey in all that he says to do. Andrew, I'll let you kind of wrap us up here as we keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the most important parts of this in verse 10, kind of drawing a conclusion for this chapter, he makes the comment that whatever exists has already been named. And I think in a lot of capacity that is discussing the idea of God back in Genesis 1, that he is the namer. He is the one who has exhibited sovereign control. He has created all these things, and he's named them. And so we're reminded of the earlier discussion in chapter 3 and 4 that God is in control of this situation. We were reminded that as much as man doesn't have control, as much as we were reminded that many of these things are outside of man's ability, he can't understand what's going to happen after to him. He doesn't see what happens beyond his short life. God is aware. God is in control. The one who has named things, the one who is stronger, He is the one in control. And that's really, I think, the overarching conclusion of this first section of Ecclesiastes 1 through 6 is that man's not in control. Man does not have the strength. Man does not have the knowledge, the wisdom to be able to understand everything. But what he can know is that there is a being who does. There is a God who does have these answers, who does understand what's going on. And our objective is really to trust him and to accept that we may not know everything, and to accept that all we can do is take our lot, live it to the best of our ability, glorify God, and wait to see what's going to happen. And that's a lack of control. That is a lot of trust that we have to exhibit. But it is such an important application. Guys, thank you so much for a good study. Again, a little bit of a, excuse me, a little bit of a shorter chapter, but certainly rich in application. Lord willing, we are going to be able to get into next week into Ecclesiastes chapter 7. We're going to have a lot of good parables, a lot of good wisdom that's going to come from these next few chapters as the author begins to kind of shift a little bit into a new perspective. But again, continuing to give us lots of good wisdom, lots of good application. So again, appreciate both Trey and Greg joining us in on this study. Appreciate all of you guys joining us to listen to these things, to continue to study with us. We pray it's been beneficial for you. We pray we're all glorifying God in what we're doing with this. Thank you so much. We will see you again next time.